Leaders Talk, the interview podcast portraying leaders who are committed to better leadership, better organizations, and a better world. Powered by Leadership Choices.
The idealistic me was like, I'm going out there and I'm going to change the world. The world is broken in so many ways, and I want to be part of the movement that helps to fix it. And I guess the older we get, the more cynical or realistic we get. And it is cliche, but in the end, the most meaningful impact that I've ever had has been on an individual level, you know? And as they'll say in the development world, and I said a lot, like, true change comes from building meaningful relationships of love and trust. I come from parents, father, culture where you want to be successful, you got to work hard. You know, it's the American dream of pick yourself up by your bootstraps and always work harder and longer than the next guy. That could not be any farther from the truth, especially in the day and age of knowledge work, which we are in now in a very global competitive environment. It's not about who works the hardest or longest. It's about who works the smartest. 2 days into the trip, I'm sitting on my surfboard on a beautiful sun setting, one of those magical days in the swells, the ocean's golden. And I look down at myself and I have this big pasty white belly. I'm out of breath because I'm exhausted and out of shape. And I'm sitting here going, you know, I'm in magazines and newspapers and getting all this press and all this media, and everyone's telling you how great you are and the amazing things that you're doing. And I felt like shit. And I looked like shit. And I realized that I was on a completely unsustainable path, and that what's the point of trying to do great things if you're not enjoying your life along the way?
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Leaders Talk, the podcast for better leadership, better organizations, and a better world. My guest today is somebody that I admire big time. Mostly because of his capacity to host a very fascinating podcast, which is the WHU Most Awesome Founders Podcast. And it is Gerrit McGowan. And Gerrit McGowan is the managing director of the WHU Entrepreneurship Center and the WHU Accelerator. He's big time into the startup ecosystem. He's mentoring young entrepreneurs on their journey to building something meaningful, something with impact, something that lasts, and something that kind of works and kind of takes off. And we are discussing his life journey, his story, and that story has taken quite some epiphanies, some pivots, some corners, some back and forth, and very, very fascinating. His ability to kind of try something, make it work, see what he likes and doesn't like, and then change and totally pivot, go back to ground and rebuild from ground up. Very, very inspirational talk. He's also very philosophical and a deep thinker and very introspective. So you will like that if you're into some reflection around that, and also what role leadership plays to build organization and how to build organizational cultures that foster flow, because Gerrit is also doing his PhD right now and researching on flow in individuals, in teams, and in entire organization. So I wish you lots of great insights from this podcast today. So, welcome, Gerrit McGowan. Welcome to the show.
Karsten, thank you for having me. It's fun to be on this side of the microphone every once in a while.
I'm a big admirer of your podcast, the WHU Most Awesome Founder Podcast, and it's a source of inspiration, I have to admit. And you've been busy these days. What have you been doing?
Wow, trying to keep a little bit less busy and not doing a good job of it, I guess. But lately, actually in the past couple weeks, we just launched the inaugural cohort of the WHU Startup Accelerator. So we have 8 founder teams that are students and alumni going through an intensive 2-month process, mentor-driven process, where we're hopefully taking their businesses from the early stage, giving them rocket fuel and preparing them for growth.
Wow. And that means you are in the WHU ecosystem, you're running a center there for this startup acceleration.
Yeah, so I'm the managing director of the WHU Entrepreneurship Center. It's been a program that's been around for a few years. Prior, it was in Dusseldorf. Since I've taken over, we've moved it to Fallander, created a long-term strategy for it, started fundraising and delivering. Really, the idea behind it is delivering entrepreneurial education that people can't get necessarily in the classroom. So the practical side of how to be an entrepreneur, and we're doing that by, leveraging the alumni here. WHU is pretty famous, not in Germany, if not around the world, as creating some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the ecosystem. So instead of just professors teaching entrepreneurship, we're bringing in a lot of these alumni and people within the ecosystem to help mentor and coach our young founders here.
Wow, this is super important and priceless in terms of value and the real life. And what I like about your work and the podcast, which I know is a labor of love, it's not something that nobody's told you to do, I guess, but you also paint a very personal picture of the founder. You try to not only get to the business plan and the rationale, the business model, but also what drives the founder. So what is important to you when you do this?
I mean, as you know, podcasting is just a fun thing to do, right? It's one of the most immersive, kind of flow-inducing experiences. You get to connect and spend an hour or two of time with a really, really smart and interesting person. And I'm a big advocate of storytelling. I used to work in Aboriginal communities where entire histories and cultures were passed down through the spoken word. I also really love the kind of neuroscience behind storytelling and the cascade of chemicals that flow through our bodies when we hear someone tell a story. So I'm less interested in interviews and point one, answer one, question two, answer two, and allowing people to kind of tell their stories and their narratives allows the listener to connect with that person and connect with them in a meaningful, tangible way, but also start to understand some of the nuances, because people will tell you what and when, but they don't often tell you why. And the magic is often in the why. And that's why I love allowing people to be on the other side of the mic and kind of tell their stories.
And now we just flip the side of the mic and let's talk about your why. So what I understood is you actually grew up in Texas, USA, the first part of your life, right?
I did. I don't admit that very often, but yes, I did.
And then there was a epiphany you just disclosed to me. Let's talk about that for a start.
So yeah, I guess, so I went to university at the University of Texas. I was there for a few very uninspired and unmotivated years. And, I come from I'm half German, half American. I grew up in a very conservative place in the 80s and 90s, boom and bust oil country of Texas. My dad worked for an oil company. So I was kind of in a community of people that were very, very different than me. It was deeply religious, very, very culturally and politically conservative, never quite fit in, but didn't know what I was doing. So I went to school, studied business, and interestingly, it was, I woke up one New Year's Day when I was 20 years old, about 20 years old, with quite a hangover. And as sometimes happens with a hangover, you start reflecting and introspecting. And I had this kind of vision of where my life was going. And it looked a hell of a lot like the people around me. And I was petrified by the thought of that. And very impulsively, I decided I had to do something right away, but I was a broke college student. I think I had about $50 in my pocket, and I spent 40 of that on a one-way bus ticket to the mountains of Colorado, packed up a backpack and my bicycle, and got a one-way ticket to a place where they would give me a job with room and board, and decided to start life over and kind of reinvent my path. And
why Colorado? I mean, it's beautiful there, but there's other beautiful countries.
Yeah, I think, it's a really good question that you ask, and it's not one that I fully unpacked. I think I was looking for inspiration, and I've always found inspiration and motivation in nature. I'm not a religious person, but if there is a higher power, something created the magic of the world around us, and the mountains has always given me joy and energy. You know, my being half German, half of my family is from Bavaria, from down on the Bodensee. I grew up skiing and playing in the mountains, and it was just the logical place for me. Something attracted me, so I went that direction.
And that also changed your path in terms of studies in a quite substantial way, actually. So what happened then?
Yeah, well, I was living in a ski town and doing what a lot of 20-somethings do in Colorado, which was working on the ski mountain in the winter, and I was a whitewater rafting guide in the summer. And that's something where you're spending day in and day out with nature. In Colorado, as beautiful as it is, just like many other places in the world, there was a lot of challenges and degradation of nature, deforestation and major shortages of water and dams, and things that I found really problematic with my young, naive and idealistic mind. And I thought I wasn't sure what I wanted to study, but I knew I wanted to go back to school. That was ingrained in me, and that was had a particular connection with rivers for what I did. So I decided to study the environment, particularly water resources and water management. So that's what I did my first degree in.
That makes a lot of sense. And then this also took you somehow into the world of development agencies. How did that come about?
Yeah. So I again, like an idealistic young person, I was pretty hardcore, militantly green and enviro. It was kind of deep ecology perspective of like, we all need to, stop wrecking the environments around us. And but I was also competing in whitewater kayaking, traveling around doing the sport, and I had the opportunity to go to Africa in 2000 and go kayaking. My best friend and I flew to Zambia to do that, and we landed in Zambia. This was, I think, October of 2000. This was literally the peak of the HIV crisis there. At the time, across the border in Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe and the government there was taking over white farms and kind of nationalistic movement, taking the property. There was a lot of violence. The Zimbabwean dollar had crashed. People were coming over into Zambia to buy bread. There were bread lines. We were going to villages where there were no young people. There were only old people and babies because everyone else had died of HIV/AIDS. And I started to see the world a little bit differently. There was, of course, it's Africa, people are poor, there's garbage everywhere. It's certainly not a pristine ecosystem. It's very much negatively impacted by humanity. And it was the first time that I had maybe the first dose of reality check, which is, what an elitist mentality to be so green and so environmentally focused, because who gives a shit about garbage if you can't feed your children, if you can't even stay alive? And it was a profound worldview shift for me. And I started to think some of the same problems that I was really interested in. I started to realize, well, maybe the environment isn't at the root cause of it. Maybe if we can improve people's livelihoods, that would be a better way to solve some of these complex world problems. So within a year, I had applied to graduate school and basically studied development planning and went on a path to become a development economist.
Wow. And then you spent some time there, and you kind of got a good look under the hood and realized, for this idealistic heart of yours, there was also a lot of stuff to remain unanswered. So what happened then?
Well, I guess the next phase was a pretty long path. I moved to Canada. I went to graduate school there. I started my first, real business, a consultancy out of graduate school. And I was really fortunate in that I got an opportunity to co-author a manual for the United Nations on kind of multi-stakeholder decision making, how you bring big groups of people together to make kind of consensus decisions. And it was around the topic of economic development at the local level. So how do you improve local livelihoods? I spent a year and a half writing this thing for free. And fortunately, once the group of us finished writing it, the UN wanted us to go out and start testing it in other communities. So I spent the next 8 years essentially implementing this process that we had developed in Africa and Asia, the Middle East, and First Nation communities in rural Canada, and really kind of using this democratization decision-making process to identify ways forward for local economies and poverty reduction specifically. And I did that for years, and I loved it. And, I was in my late 20s, traveling all over the world, going to, I worked in post-crisis, post-war Liberia, and in the West Bank of Palestine during the Intifada, and, in rural Philippines, and, in the middle of Uganda during crazy times. So I got to go to these incredible places, work with incredible humans. But as I got older and I did it longer, I started to have some philosophical questions about that as well. I was in Africa, they called me the Mzungu, the white man, right? I was this young, at least relatively wealthy white person coming into these communities and kind of helping them figure out their problems. And even though the process was very much bottom up and it was all about empowering, there was still this huge power dynamic between myself and the people that I was working with. And no matter how much I tried to circumvent that, that was not going away. Mm. And then, over time, especially because we were on the planning side of things, what you think would be very rewarding, the outcomes of the work you do sometimes take years and years and years. And, after 7-8 years of doing this, I started kind of mentoring younger people that were coming in to do it as well. And I immediately saw myself, this idealistic young person that thought, hey, I'm coming here to make the world a better place. But what I realized was I was getting so much more out of that experience than I could ever give. And what I realized is that, the development world is actually the most selfish career you can take, because every day you're being kind of reinforced of how good you are, and you're doing something good and you're doing something positive, and it's so easy to forget what you're actually getting out of it. So I kind of found myself a little jaded by that process. And I said, well, this whole system of, bilateral aid, countries donating to poorer countries and then sending in their experts to go and figure out how to do it, was so problematic to me that over time I was like, this is maybe not the path to having a great impact that it possibly could. At the time I was toying with technology and other things, which was always kind of a side passion of mine. And having been an entrepreneur, kind of accidentally building multiple consulting firms, I said, maybe there is a different way. Maybe the real impact, the way to improve livelihoods is not through giving or, through this kind of hierarchical paternalistic model, but maybe, real change comes from innovation and from the ground up. So okay. End of life chapter.
And there another epiphany kind of opened up. But let's go back to that. What's the core of this approach to change a society? Because I think that is also something that we can learn from today in the organizational world. So is there a way to kind of distill it to a kind of a punchline?
I mean, first of all, I would say this idea of broad social change, and I don't want to sound too cliche, but the idealistic me was I'm going out there and I'm going to change the world. The world is broken in so many ways, and I want to be part of the movement that helps to fix it. And I guess the older we get, the more cynical or realistic we get. And it is cliche, but in the end, the most meaningful impact that I've ever had has been on an individual level, and as they'll say in the development world, and I said a lot, true change comes from building meaningful relationships of love and trust. Mm-hmm. And what I found was that I impacted a lot of people's lives, but not collectively, only one-on-one. It was through compassion and caring, intimacy, vulnerability, and that deep level of human interaction where the change happened. Now, that being said, that can be facilitated with other great things, great processes, great environments, great technologies. But in the end, it's people and people in the end. So.
Yeah, resonates totally with me. Also, in our work as coaches, we work with individuals, and certainly we have impact with them. But the question is, are we impacting the system on a systematic or on a systems level, right? And that's yet a totally different discussion. Okay. And then you said, okay, well, innovation. Maybe innovation will fix it. So what was that then?
So, yeah, I guess life took another turn that was somewhat unexpected. So the work that I was doing in the development field, we would bring together diverse stakeholders to try to come up with consensus decisions. And sometimes those stakeholders were really contentious. You've got the Israeli military on one side and Palestinian local leaders on the other, or in more simple terms, you would have the nonprofit community, the development community, and the private sector and local village people. And what we realized was some people were really committed to the processes and others weren't. And most specifically, the ones that had the least resources were most committed, and the ones that had the most resources were least committed. And in most cases, that was the private sector and the business community. And, the governments would say, oh, if we just had more money, and the nonprofit said if we had more donors. And then you had the people that had all the resources, which were the companies that were saying, hey, I don't have a vested interest in this. So the problem that I wanted to tackle was, how can we incentivize the business community to participate in social good and improving livelihoods? And I was kind of pondering this for a number of years. And interestingly, I'd come back to Germany to visit family over a holiday. And there was this new kind of model of business out there. And it was actually a company people in Germany know well called Payback, right? The local loyalty program. And with Payback, you can go to your supermarket, or you can go to other stores, and you earn this currency. And that currency creates loyalty, makes people want to get more of that currency. And a friend of mine and I started deconstructing the mechanics of this. And he said, hey, wait a second. If you can motivate people by issuing them this currency to engage in particular behaviors, I wonder if you could do that for some type of social benefit, essentially. So we came up with this concept called Kula, which is a social good currency that people could earn this currency based on their purchase behaviors. But instead of taking that and getting a coupon or buying a magazine subscription or a flat screen TV, they could actually give it to a good cause. In our case, we brought together 3 million nonprofits all around the world, local schools, things like that. So people could shop at their favorite stores, earn this currency, and then donate them to their kid's classroom or to their church or to their favorite environmental cause. And we kind of put those pieces together. We actually started the company in München. This was in 2010. Back then, things were a little bit different than they are now. It was hard to raise money, so ended up moving back to Colorado and raising venture capital, growing that business till we had some Fortune 100 clients, and had some traction.
That is pretty amazing, and this is an idea that still lives on, right? I think the company no longer exists. But I think the idea has now been adopted by others, multiple platforms. Facebook has fundraisers, there's smile.amazon.com, there's also betterplace.org. I mean, all these kind of places. So you were kind of bleeding edge with this idea.
Yeah, timing is a bitch, isn't it? Sometimes you're right on time, sometimes you're a little bit early. But I mean, I won't blame completely timing. I was a first-time tech entrepreneur. And I probably made every mistake in the book. I always say that the business succeeded in spite of me. We did have a zeitgeist topic, but once again, just like in the development world, I got so much more than I could ever give out of it. The lessons that you learn and the people that you meet on a journey like that are immeasurable. Maybe you don't recognize them till later in life, but. Yeah,
absolutely. And there were some hard lessons at that point in time, right? You also kind of hit a personal wall. Do you want to talk about that?
I've probably hit quite a few personal walls. I was building that business. We were an enterprise software as a service, and our first client was JetBlue Airlines, and we had Coca-Cola, then we had Kellogg's, national restaurant chains, big clients with really long sales cycles. Lots and lots of travel. This was pre-COVID, obviously, so we actually had to fly to places. I was living out of a suitcase 200 days a year. We'd raised 4 or 5 million in venture capital. There was pressures coming from all sorts of directions. I was forced to fire my best friend, one of my co-founders. There was an emotional journey. I wasn't spending time with my family. And then I also went from being an athlete to being fat and tired. I picked up smoking, something I had done since I was like 17. I was completely overwhelmed by stress and the workload. I didn't know how to balance it very well. And I hit a burnout pretty much. And I hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years. I finally decided to take a vacation. I went with my best friend, who actually I was in Africa with many years before, flew us down to Nicaragua to go surfing. And 2 days into the trip, I'm sitting on my surfboard on a beautiful sun setting, one of those magical days in the swells, the ocean's golden. And I look down at myself and I have this big pasty white belly. I'm out of breath because I'm exhausted and out of shape. And I'm sitting here going, I'm in magazines and newspapers and getting all this press and all this media, and everyone's telling you how great you are and the amazing things that you're doing. And I felt like shit. And I looked like shit. And I realized that I was on a completely unsustainable path. And that what's the point of trying to do great things if you're not enjoying your life along the way? And I looked over at my best friend Dave and I said, Dave, I quit. And he said, what are you talking about? We've only been out here for 20 minutes surfing. And I was like, no, I'm quitting my company. And I paddled in and sent an email, called a board meeting, flew home the next week, and parted ways with the business that I started, which was maybe the hardest professional thing I ever did. And without question, in hindsight, the greatest decision of my life.
Wow. Okay. And what came next then?
A lot of healing and recovery, to say the least. I moved into the mountains and reconnected with nature, kayaked every day, hiked in the mountains, planted a garden, ran around barefoot, spent a bunch of time reconnecting with my why, my purpose, my identity, the things that I love, my family, all the things that I felt like I had neglected for years, being myopically focused on this venture, and did that for a while until some interesting opportunities came my way. Got an opportunity to go to a university in Switzerland and help set up some startup activities there. Gave me a chance to be closer to my family here in Germany. And started, I tell people now that if I'm not building ventures, I'm helping other people build theirs. And that was maybe the first foray into going from being an entrepreneur to being maybe a mentor and advisor and coach for entrepreneurs.
Wow. So I think you have this ability to pivot, and also you don't seem to be so stuck on standard of living or like a certain status quo. You are kind of, when there's a time in your life where you need to change, you're just ready to kind of give it all away and start over new from pretty much green field, right?
Yeah, I would say I'm pretty good at that. I'm not too attached to material stuff. I'm not, even when I've had tons of money, I don't drive nice cars or buy expensive clothes. I have my few luxuries that I like, but as long as I have my kayak and nice gear and a good snowboard and a few things, the thing that I value most is my time. And you can't buy that stuff. And the way I see it, like I told you, I'm not a very religious person, so I figure I got one life to live, and I want to squeeze every damn moment out of that. And the more I focus my attention on wealth creation, the less time I get to focus on the things that I really care about, which are relationships, my health, the beautiful world that I live in, the people that I care about. I'm also lucky, I'm educated. I'm a white man. Like, I have all the opportunities in the world. So I've never, it's been a long time since I've been destitute or poor or anything like that. So it's not that I'm a mendicant that has given away all of my wealth, but like I tell my son all the time, like, being wealthy is not how much you accrue, it's how little you need.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. So you started with your father, who has a very different life, or had a very different lifestyle, different career choice. You kind of lived a life so far that is pretty much the description of the opposite, right? Of a totally different concept with totally different values. So what are you trying to portray or give to your son in terms of what is important in life?
I mean, so I think I come from a generation where parents told their kids, like, this is how you're supposed to live life, and these are the rules you're supposed to live by. This is the path that you're supposed to take. And, maybe I was a bit of a rebel in that regard. It's like, if you tell me to zig left, I'm going to zig right. I'm not like that with my son. I guess what I've learned in my life is, like, you need to build a life around yourself, in your own image, in your own values, in your own priorities. There is no one timeline. Like, I came from a place where you finished high school, you went to college at 18, you graduated college at 22, you started your job at 22, at 25 you got married, at 27 you had kids, by 29 you bought a house, and blah, 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 blah. And that was not my intention. And not everybody operates on the same timeline, and society puts a lot of pressure on people to fit that particular mold. So what I tell my son, and what I tell a lot of young people, is, like, the clock is yours to set, the path is yours to forge, and in the end, you have to feel like you lived with purpose and meaning and joy. And whatever takes you there, that's all that's important. So I look at my son, sometimes I don't like the decisions that he's making, but if he's happy, he loves himself, he loves his life, that's the best gift a parent can have.
Absolutely. I mean, we have 4 kids, and I would kind of echo that approach. On the other hand, it is also sometimes very challenging for youngsters to just be happy or just have a meaningful life, because all these options, what to do, and so where to develop. So I think that is also for the young people at WHU. Sometimes there's all these opportunities, all these options, how to optimize yourself, how to build this meaningful life. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, when even 5 years ago, I would tell my son to follow his find your passion. If you find your passion, you'll do what not a day of your life will feel like work. I think my mentality has changed a little bit on that. Like, passion doesn't have to be your work. Passion can be something that you love to do when you come home from work, and finding what you love, the things that make you happy. It's just a matter of trying a lot of different things. Maybe what's laid out in front of you. When I was a kid in Texas, like, I played tennis and football, and, like, did things that Texas people do, and didn't really find anything I really liked that much out of that. And I had to go try a whole bunch of things, experience the world, travel, to kind of find the things that made me tick. The great thing is I didn't have someone holding a clock up saying you have to do it by this time. Again, I'm also male. It's different if you're female. There's other implications. I had a child at a really young age, unmarried. So my circumstances are different than others. But, in the end, we have to listen to our hearts. We have to find what makes us tick, and try to be open to opportunities that come our way.
Absolutely. And talking about meaningful relationships, despite the difference with your father, or in terms of lifestyle, were you able to have a good connection? No. Actually, I didn't. But I would say that no one in my family really did.
He was a hard man. He passed away. He was a hard man, left home when he was 16, grew up in Brooklyn, in the 40s, kind of rough, and made it on his own. And did incredible for himself, did it through football scholarships and getting through school and working his way up the ladder. But as a result of his ability to overcome his own adversity, he believed there was only one way. Mm-hmm. There was only one path. And if you didn't take that path, you were wrong, And I think, I was someone, I left home at a young age too, and I had to kind of forge my own path. But some people overcome challenges and they become very narrow in their worldview and see only one right. Everything was black and white. Other people overcome challenges and they realize that there's many, many ways and many paths and lots of shades of gray. So I think philosophically and fundamentally, we were just very, very different in the way we saw the world and the way we saw kind of taking these journeys through life.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. And so back to your life story. So you are in St. Gallen. Actually, we had Professor Heike Bruch on the podcast the other episode. And you were there to do what you do now for WHU, just for St. Gallen, right?
Yeah, I kind of helped set up some coaching there. And essentially, this part of the startup lab, we helped design kind of a physical space. Again, St. Gallen was a few years ahead of WHU, and that, hey, there was some great startups coming there, but the university needs to do some work in supporting that ecosystem. St. Gallen is a bit like Fallander in that it's not in a big city. It doesn't have all of these resources in place, but it's got all this talent coming into the university. So went there, did that for a little while, and it actually was the catalyst of an accidental business. It's actually my favorite business story, and maybe one of the greatest successes considering how it started. But I was working with all these young Swiss founders that were building new ventures. Anyone that's been to Switzerland knows it's a pretty expensive place. It's a pretty great quality of life. So you had all these entrepreneurs that were looking for engineering talent, but the problem is they're hard to find, because if you're a young software developer, you could get a job at a big company or at a bank making really good money and 10 weeks of paid vacation, and why go work for a startup for no money and no security? So they were all struggling to find development resources, and I thought maybe I could find a way to help. And I was hanging out one weekend and decided I was going to see if I could find people. So I started reaching out to different software firms all over Eastern Europe because I knew it was cheaper there. And I woke up one morning, staying in a hotel in the Allgäu, and I had a bunch of emails from Macedonia, from software development firms in Macedonia. And, I've traveled to like 60 countries. I know the world pretty well. I literally had to Google Maps Macedonia because I wasn't exactly sure where it was. And I was like, oh, okay, this is a former Balkan country. And I had such a positive response. I literally took a train to Memmingen and bought a ticket on Wizz Air to Skopje, Macedonia that day, and landed in Skopje and got an Airbnb and just started setting up meetings with these different software companies and met some really great folks. And it was towards the end of my trip. I went to meet one of the companies in a cafe in the center of town, and these two guys walk up, young, in their 20s, sharp looking, really smart guys. We sit down and have a conversation, and they were a group of software engineers, and they'd recently finished university together, and they had to do a project in university to develop a mobile app. And they built this mobile app as part of their school project, like a gimmicky kind of app, and they put it in the marketplace, and all of a sudden they had 18 million downloads. And so they applied, they won this Samsung app challenge. They won 150,000 euros, set up a company. They said, we're going to build a software company. And they had all this talent in the world, but being in Macedonia, not EU, kind of its own isolated country between Greece and the Balkans, didn't have access to markets. And then here comes this random American guy living in Switzerland. I show up, I'm like, hey, I know some people that need developers. So I started connecting them with some of the young startups that I was working with, and ended up moving back to the US the next year. And coming back after having sold my company, I had a lot of people reaching out to me looking for software development, and I kept feeding them to these Macedonian guys and who were doing an incredible job. Next thing I know, we had a growing customer base. We're making a really good money. Those guys were making incredible money from what they had before. The team grew to 30 people, company grew, started getting venture-backed clients. And actually one of the clients we had was a venture-backed startup that grew and grew and grew. And they exited a couple years ago and ended up buying the majority of the company in Macedonia. Now the CEO of the Macedonian company is in Berlin building his own startup, just went through Techstars. All the other guys are, life transforming. And for me, as well as for them, another one of those experiences where like random things happen, and who would have thunk that, what an impact it would have on all the people along the way.
Wow, and this catapulted you into the center of the international startup scene. You were part of that before, but that kind of got a different dynamic out of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, it was great because I had built a technology company without technology experience. And I can't count how many times I must have pissed off my engineers with unreasonable expectations going, how long are you saying this is going to take? We need it by tomorrow. And then I got this chance to be on the other side, where we were the service provider for people, for entrepreneurs, in the shoes that I used to be in. And I saw it from another perspective, gave me a tremendous amount of empathy and understanding for what engineers go through, especially with, entrepreneurs that are constantly changing priorities and shifting gears, and what that means for an engineering team. It really helped me, I think, become a better entrepreneur, but also understand, what a non-technical entrepreneur goes through. Right. And how to bridge this kind of business and technology divide. And somehow that probably became a little bit of my USP in what I do now, which is work with entrepreneurs that maybe aren't the deep tech people, the ones that are commercializing, trying to build the businesses, helping them understand how to build those types of teams, put the pieces together to raise capital and find early product market fit.
Understood. And this notion of societal impact, is this still there in your work today, or is this something that you fulfill with other means?
In terms of societal impact, I mean, the answer is maybe, right? Like I work with hundreds of founders a year. I work on a weekly basis with at least a dozen of them, if not more. Does that have a societal impact? Maybe, but I don't know if I care. What I care about is having an impact. And one of the things being at WHU, just like being at St. Gallen, just like being at the university I built a program for in the US, is having an impact on a one-on-one level. And in the end, like it comes back to the development world. Like if you want to have a big impact, you impact lots of individuals, and that collectively has a big impact. So, here at WHU, I meet with one founder team at a time, and is one relationship going to change the world? No. But if I work with hundreds of entrepreneurs over the course of a number of years, and they help build up an ecosystem and build up new energy and culture around this topic, then yeah, maybe over time that has some kind of impact. But I'm older now. I'm much more patient. I don't need everything yesterday. And in the end, it comes down to the people, you empower. As when you're young, you want to do everything. When you're older, you're more inclined to empower other people to do things. Yeah,
absolutely. And also I think the definition of change and meaning changes with, growing older. And I was just thinking, Fridtjof Bergmann just passed away the other day, the inventor or co-inventor of new work. And this is also a way of societal change in organizations to make organizations a more human place. And sometimes my exposure with startups so far was that the culture of these places is pretty ruthless, right? I mean, like, get it done. I don't care how. I don't do this softy kind of how do you feel kind of discussion. Just get it done, no matter how. And we need to scale, we need to hire, we need to expand, we need to do this and that, and we need to raise money, blah blah blah. So very much kind of cutthroat almost, and was a bit disenchanting sometimes for me. And I was wondering, maybe there's a way to bring also this idea of an organizational culture into these startups where people also want to still work when they get older, when they have family, when they are not always ready to work 20 hours a day. Does that make sense?
Oh, so much. I mean, this is what I spend so much of my energy talking about now, because this idea of this like move fast, grind hard, it's a horseshit idea. It's not sustainable. There are some pundits out there in the world that preach this stuff, and it's part of the like lingua franca and the culture around startups. I call that hustle porn, right? You got to hustle. You got to hustle. The Gary Vaynerchuks of the world that are saying there's always somebody working harder and longer, or Elon Musk, and it's, what is it? Being an entrepreneur is like chewing on glass and staring into the abyss. Like, what a bunch of bullshit. I'm sorry to use my language, but this is the one that fires me up, right? I grew up in that generation. I come from parents, father, culture where you want to be successful, you got to work hard. It's the American dream of pick yourself up by your bootstraps and always work harder and longer than the next guy. That could not be any farther from the truth, especially in the day and age of knowledge work, which we are in now, in a very global competitive environment. It's not about who works the hardest or longest. It's about who works the smartest. It's about who takes the limited resource of time and uses that effectively, not maximizing every minute of it. Because humans are big bundles of energy. We have limited amount of that resource, and once it's gone, quality goes downhill, energy goes downhill. And I guess the other piece that's worth mentioning is organizations, right? Like, a lot of people separate, they put the category of individuals and organizations. And I think we got to get over this mentality. Organizations are collections of individuals. They're only as successful and culturally sound as the people that are a part of them. You want to build great organizational cultures, focus on people, focus on the individuals. You create happy people that feel like they're autonomous, they have agency, they have meaningful relationships, they have trust. The chances of you having a successful organization will grow exponentially. If you double down on the organization and all the nonsense and structures and systems to make a good corporate culture, and it's not focused on what the people want, you're going to have a clash, and you're going to have the whole system collapse in the end. In the end, it's still people, right? We have to care about people, and every person has different interests and different priorities. And I think my story is a good example, as many's, is what might be my goal or my priority today may not be that tomorrow, So having that interaction, that communication, that dialogue that allows the organization to evolve based on the needs of the people in it. Of course, it's worth mentioning, just like democracy, just like these other big concepts, most things fail at scale. So I am a big believer that actually, as far as an organizational unit, the startup is actually the most egalitarian of all. It's not this cutthroat thing. If the people that are participating in it feel empowered, it's just the opposite. It's probably the most utopian type of business structure you could have. People are making decisions collectively. They're able to change directions really quickly. They can move fast. They can try. It's a culture that enables and allows for failure and learning, while the bigger the organization, the harder that is to do. So there's perceptions. Some of them are true. There's reality, which I think is probably in the middle. And then there is an egalitarian kind of model that I think is at the heart of why people like me gravitate towards startups and have never worked for a big company in my life.
Yeah, and I totally get that. I mean, we are not a startup anymore. We're 13 years of age, but we are bootstrapped, and so we have that, structures where we can kind of move quickly despite the fact that people are older. But when you are in a world where there's venture capital, when there's pressure, when you have to scale, all of a sudden I feel that it can change the culture, not necessarily to the better.
Absolutely. And I mean, honestly, startup is not, the term makes us think, hey, this is a young company, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be there. I think nowadays startup is really a reflection of organizational culture and the way in which it operates. And it is most certainly not an indicator of the age of the people in there. I don't know if you know this, but the average age of a successful exited startup founder is 46 years old. It is not the 20-something in a hoodie working in a basement. The most likely to sell a startup successfully is in their 40s. Okay. So it's not a variable of age, and frankly, I don't even think it's a variable of the age of the company. It is the mentality and the way in which people engage and operate, and probably the fundamental string that runs through it is a culture of failure and iteration. Fail fast, repeat, learn, do it again, and allowing that to happen in a safe space. That to me is at the core of what a startup can do that other organizations can't.
And Gerrit, being Gerrit, you don't only have an opinion about that, you actually researched about that, and you are doing your PhD about flow in entrepreneurship. So is there a punchline of how do you get to that flow on an organization level? Is that even possible?
It is actually. I mean, flow, the kind of science of kind of immersive experience, the psychology of immersive experiences. It's now moving into the neuroscience realm, being much more physiological as well. There's kind of two streams within that kind of discourse. One is the individual flow. You may think of Michael Jordan never missing a basket, or John Coltrane playing the saxophone and riffing and improvising, or whatever it might be. This peak individual performance. And then there's also the team flow, right? Which is a much newer concept, which is groups of people can operate in an environment of peak or optimal performance. And I think the science and the research is identifying there are some interventions that organizations and individuals can do to promote that. At a foundational level, everyone needs to feel safe in their environment. They need to be getting immediate feedback from their environment. That means, you're trying something, and either the environment or other individuals are responding to that, and you're able to react. You react to that. There is a level of deep concentration that needs to take place. But I think taking it to a practical level, probably the key thing is human interaction. And one of the great analogs for optimal team performance has actually come from the stand-up comedians, from improv comedy. And there's a researcher, he was a student of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who's kind of the father of flow. His name's Keith Sawyer. He wrote a book called Group Genius, highly recommend it. He's a professor at the University of North Carolina, and he was the first guy really to study team flow. And what he looked at was, it was one of these kind of comedy troupes that spun off of Saturday Night Live, the TV show, and they would do these improvisational routines where somebody would, say a word or a phrase, and then the group had to riff on the phrase. And the key to unlocking that process is additive communication. So that means you're never saying no, and you're always saying or and this, and this. And so everything is very positive. It's always building. It's focused on interaction, and it doesn't work without equally balanced two-way communication. So it creates an environment of trust. It allows people to not fear failure. So if you tell me something back, I'll just riff off whatever it is you're saying. And it creates the psychological condition that is really enabling for everyone involved, and people get, as the creative juices start flowing and the dopamine and serotonin starts going, it creates really positive environments. So now the group research is really looking at those analogs, as well as like improvisational jazz musicians, to see how you can take those type of dynamics and bring them into the work environment. And there are some easy ways to do that, just in the way people interact, the way leaders connect with their employees, environments of trust, creating physical spaces that empower people. And I think the research is just scratching the surface of what we can do in that space.
Wow. And I learned something. That's great. And what does that mean for leadership? I mean, is there a way where leaders can interact in a certain way that has a tendency to rather inspire flow?
Yeah, so I mean, I think creating an open environment of a safe space of trust is really important. We talked about failure in the startup environment. That is a key mechanism of flow, right? I'll paint a little picture for you, and I'll try to do it since we're doing it in audio. But one of the key conditions of flow is what they call the challenge skill balance. So if you can imagine an axis, and on the y-axis is challenge, and on the x-axis is skill. Flow happens somewhere right in that 45 degree, 40 to 50 degree realm. Because if you have too much challenge and not enough skill, you have anxiety. If you have too much skill and not enough challenge, you have boredom, right? So you're kind of dancing between these two worlds of employees that are maybe apathetic and bored and disengaged. On the other side, you have employees or workers that are stressed and anxious, fearing failure, discomfort. So at least at a philosophical level, you have to figure out how to create that middle space where people are constantly being challenged. They're pushing their boundaries, which is motivating, it's inspiring, it's creating those little wins that give people confidence and strength, but making sure they're still afforded space that they can fail and try again, where they're allowed to get that immediate feedback from their environment, so constant engagement and reinforcement, where they have very clear goals, so they have to know where they're going to go, or they won't be able to get there, they won't be able to get into flow. So there's a number of different mechanisms that, if you just think of this in theoretical terms, how do you implement that into your work environment? How do you make sure everyone has clear goals? How do you make sure everyone has right amount of challenge but not too much anxiety? How do you implement ways for them to get immediate feedback and engagement? All of these things can be done in a multitude of ways. If you just think that maybe there's 5 or 6 things that you can focus on to create that flow-inducing space, the probability of that happening with some or many of your employees or colleagues will increase substantially.
Makes total sense. And it's really good to see how you get into flow state when you're talking about it.
I mean, it's one of the reasons I love podcasting so much, right? It's like such a flowy vibe, right?
Absolutely. So thank you for this ride or flyover over your life so far, Gerrit. What's happening in summer or after summer? What's next?
Gosh, I feel like I should practice this, because when I go home and see my mom in a few weeks, she's going to ask the same question. It's a good question. Right now, our attention is focused on getting this program set up at WHU and making sure this cohort of founders is in a good place. I'll continue working with the handful of investments and advisory roles that I have with startups. The next step is a little bit of travel, something that we have been missing for the past year or so. My partner and I are both vaccinated, so we're very much looking forward to having our toes in the sand and some floating down some rivers and playing mountains. And then the next step will be likely some life in the big city. So the plan is to relocate to Berlin soon, working on some the investment side of things, some fun new projects, and we'll let life take us where it's meant to go. So being open for cool opportunities.
Sounds really exciting. Another chapter of your life. Okay. So Gerrit, just like you, something I learned from you, I have some standard questions that I tend to ask all guests in the podcast. Uh-huh. Is there one thing, if you look back on life, on the story that you just described to us, is there anything that you would do differently?
I mean, probably the cookie cutter answer is I wish I could have figured some of these things out a hell of a lot faster than I did. But, I did have this conversation with a young person recently, and I always feel like the answer to this question is a great look into where someone is in their life right now. Because if you like your life now and you're in a good place, you tend to realize that all of those weird turns and screw ups and mess ups, you wouldn't be in the place that you are now because of it, without them, you know? So would I do anything differently? I would say I always wish I had more time with my family and the people that I love. There were times where, you know, this weird journey took me away from those people, but I wouldn't be where I am now without it. And I kind of like where I'm at. So
yeah,
no regrets. No regrets.
That's great. Where do you get, I mean, I think this work with young entrepreneurs must be something that is inspiring, where you get tons of inspiration from talking to these people. But is there any other place, or how do you inspire yourself?
You know, going back to the old days, like it's nature that drives me, you know. And I mean, pretty much every morning I go for a walk up out of Fallander and, you know, get up into the trees and you know, this stuff has amazing neurochemical properties, the things it does for our body and minds. I need to turn off my brain, so throw me in my kayak in a crazy whitewater rapid and I'm completely present and focused in the moment. Yeah, so for me it's usually nature or playing some music or but then again, it's conversations like this too. You know, it's speaking with inspiring people about meaningful, deep, I love the German word oberflächlich, the non-superficial stuff, and like let's get down and dirty and talk about life. Like these things recharge me, you know. They give me the fuel to keep on trucking. So thank you, by the way.
Absolutely. That's my ultimate kind of coaching question. Which question did I not ask you yet and should have asked?
Oh, wow. That's a tough one. I mean, I think the topic that I'm just so passionate about now is probably one we didn't really cover, which is the human brain, you know, and the kind of neuroscience and the neurochemistry of what makes us tick. And that's this thing that's been kind of being woven in and out of life right now. I refer to it when I'm helping founders do their pitches and talk about the neurochemistry of storytelling and the kind of neuroscience of well-being and optimal performance. So if we ever have another conversation, let's talk norepinephrine and cortisol and all the things that I'm still very much learning about. But we're at a really exciting time in the world right now. Technology is going nuts. Our understanding of the human body and the human mind is like we've never seen before. I feel so blessed to be alive at this time. If you're someone that craves knowledge and craves learning, we are so fortunate to be in this time and place. So what next is probably a question I'd love to cover one day. Where do we go from here?
Wow, I love this optimism and the scope of your thinking. It's really, really broad and inspiring for myself. So Gerrit, I think that's the ultimate closing word. So thank you so much for this really very, very interesting and inspiring journey, and so your deep introspection to that. So it was great, and look forward to following your path and, you know, connect again in a couple of years or so.
Awesome. Karsten, thank you for like a super fun, super flowy experience. This is one of my favorite things to do. It was an absolute pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you, Gerrit. All the best.
Thanks.
And what have you learned, Karsten?
Wow, what a great journey. I really like this kind of discussions where you can go on forever, and you really have to force yourself to stop at one point. Because there's just so much more questions that come up when you listen to the answers of Gerrit. So I hope you took a lot away from that. And if you want, just write me an email with your thoughts, with your reflections, karsten.drath@leadershipchoices.com. You can find my email address in the show notes as well. And so what's up next? So the next big thing on my side is the next fundraising journey. You may recall that Leadership Choices is a proud sponsor of the CIS Foundation. The CIS Foundation gives scholarships to young people between 16 and 20 years of age to research a topic abroad, travel alone, without own money other than the scholarship. and then write a thesis about it. And so really kind of leave their comfort zone, but with some sort of safety net, because there's also mentors that support them, and all of that stuff. And I've, when I was a young man, 30 years ago, I did a couple of these trips, 2 of these trips actually. One of them led me to Iceland, where I studied scientific whaling. And 2017, I made a decision to support the important work of this organization. And I'm doing this by cycling the world and, having sponsors that pay for being a sponsor and help us fund some of these scholarships. And so the next trip this year, due to COVID, I'm derailing north. And so the plan is to start in Lübeck, Germany, and go from there to Malmö, Sweden, and from there all the way up to the North Cape. That's 3,000 kilometers, and back then somehow. That will take me a month, and I'm heading off June 16 from Germany. By then, fully vaccinated, tested, and all that stuff. So very, very safe, and looking very much forward to that trip, and also the possibility to continue to support CIS with their important work. If you want to follow me, you can do this on my blog, which is www.fundraising-for-cis.blog. Again, you will find this in the show notes. And there's daily updates, provided I have internet access, with videos and pictures and stories from the road. So you can get some entertainment for the summertime if you want. So thank you for listening in. Thank you for your interest. I wish you all the best. Stay safe, and looking forward to meet you next time here. Bye for now.
This was an episode of Leaders Talk, the interview podcast portraying leaders who are committed to better leadership, better organizations, and a better world, powered by Leadership Choices. If you want to give us feedback, please send an email to leaderstalk@leadership-choices.com. Thank you for listening.